That's the way we want to get it started.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce the author of Comic Shop, The Retail Mavericks, who created a new geek culture. This is Dan Gearino from Columbus, Ohio. Dan, welcome to Flying Colors. Welcome everyone here.
Thanks a lot. So, just to start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why this book came about, and then I'm going to introduce all of these guys. And a lot of the people on this panel today are folks that I interviewed for this book. And this came about because I would talk over and over again with my local store owner in Columbus, Ohio. He's a guy named Gib Bickle. And we talked about the comics business a lot. I'm a business reporter in my day job. I cover the auto industry. I cover energy companies. And this is a weird business. Comics are a weird business. They're unlike other businesses, and all these guys can just nod. They know it. This is, and Gib and I would talk about the people, and we'd talk about how the business got to be the way that it is. And one of the things that he would mention from time to time is that this person or that person had died recently. And I don't remember who it was, but there was one of those times where Gib said somebody needs to go out and interview these guys. And it may have been when Roy died, when Roy Root died. But there are a whole bunch, a whole bunch of guys that contributed so much to this business. So about 2.5 years ago, I started working on this, and I interviewed each and every one of these guys. And that's the book you see before you. So we're going to just talk a little bit about kind of what all these guys have done in the business, and people will have a chance to answer questions. I think the easiest way to introduce the panel maybe would just be to have everyone introduce yourselves. Tell us your name and kind of tell us how you're connected to all of us. So starting with Joe.
Well, I'm Joe Field. I own Flying Colors Comics and other cool stuff with my wife Libby, and we've been here for 29 years. I've been in the comics business for 31. Mike and I were partners in WonderCon way back when. So that's my quick story.
I'm Jim Friel, both in Michigan and here. I spent 20 years in wholesale distribution of new comics, and now I'm working part-time at Escapist Comics in Berkeley as the old comics guy.
And that kind of undersells the fact that Jim has done everything in the business and has known everyone in the business. But okay, well, we'll get to that. But yeah. Mike.
So I'm Mike Friedreich. I had a 35-year career in comics. It was a great time. I worked as a writer, as a publisher, as a marketing executive, and worked with Joe to run WonderCon. And what I did for most of my career was run an agency for 20 years representing artists.
I'm Dick Swan, also known as the Big Guy. And I started selling comics out of my garage in the mid-'60s and going to conventions in '68. And we opened our first store. Bud was one of the partners there in Comic World in 1969 in San Jose. Another store in the early 70s, part of Comics and Comics, and later the Big Guys Comics in Mountain View. And I sell on eBay now as the Big Guys Comics still.
Bud?
I'm Bud Plant. I am still selling comics related stuff like I started doing in 1970, and with a bunch of partners and we opened probably the first comic shop on the West Coast maybe in 1968, and then I was involved with Comics and Comics. We started that in 1972, and Dick of course was part of that, and been involved with a little bit of publishing. I was a distributor for a few years, and fortunately I got out of that. That's not a lot of fun, and yeah.
And I'm Brian Hibbs. I feel like I'm the kid on this panel because I was born in 1967, which is But on the other hand, my store's been around since 1989, and I have employees who were born in 1992, so it all comes around, I guess. It makes me feel really, really old as well. So yeah, comics, we're lifers.
So all of these guys have told me a whole bunch of great stories about their time in the business, and we actually could spend all day just on Dick Swan stories, but we're not going to. But one thing I wanted to ask first, though, guys, and this would be for Dick and Bud. So the two of you were co-owners of Comic World when you were really young. tell us about opening that store and kind of where you were in your lives at that point.
Well, I met Bud at the flea market in 1966, the Berryessa Flea Market in San Jose. And I went to my first convention in Dallas in 1968. And in Houston in 69, we bought a big collection.
The four of us drove to
Yeah.
Houston together in
Was-
'69.
Me and Jim Buser and John Barrett and Bud. And when we came back, we opened Comic World, which was at first in San Fernando and San Jose. And we bought a collection in Houston. And 4 days after we got back from the convention, we opened the store. And I kind of remember it cost $85 a month because we just needed to come up with like $21.25 a piece or something. And you could touch both walls.
The store was actually a old stairway for a hotel that they had closed down, and they turned the stairway into the smallest store in existence. And it had previously been a shop called Bead World. So we were so cheap, we said, well, we'll just white out bead and put comic World. That's how sophisticated we were back in those days.
Well, and this will help indicate the kind of the research process for this book. So actually, the Bead World, Comic World question is something that I asked of a bunch of people. So actually, Dick and Bud have slightly different recollections of this, about whether Bead World was next door, or whether.
They moved next door, I thought.
Oh, okay.
They
They were in our location, and they were upgrading into a slightly bigger store.
Okay.
It was like 3 feet wider.
Oh, okay. So I don't even know if I mentioned Bead World but when you look at the sign for Comic World, you can just it looks like you could have easily. Was Bead World the same sign? You just put comic
That
up there?
sign that was in a window was done by Al Davron, who's a friend of Bud's and some fanzines he did later on, and still around. I saw Al a couple weeks ago.
So when we think of opening a small business today, you think of getting loans and getting lawyers involved and all this.
$21.25.
Yep. Like, who managed it? Like, just give me an idea of, because this is not like a business like you would think of today, I don't think. Like, what was it like to be at that store when it was open?
There were 3 stores in San Jose. Nobody had new comics. So everybody was just old comics. One of them was Side Bottom. Side Bottom was built on underground comics. Frank Scadina owned what was Seven Sons and became Marvel Galaxy, and it was comics and movie posters. And then our store was all the things that we liked. We loved DCs. Each one of us had something we were hooked on. Bud was hooked on quality comics. John was hooked on MLJ comics. I was EC nut.
So what would happen is if anything came into the store, basically we'd all divvy it up. And so that's why we weren't a particularly good store. I mean, Sidebottom's shop, Sidebottom was much more into money and actually making a living than we were. We were just a bunch of kids in high school, you know.
It was all about trying to get more comics, and what we were looking
What's
for.
a useful way? It's a useful strategy for it's like, what hours was the store open? I'm just thinking of like, maybe I'm thinking too much of like a business today, but I imagine someone having to do a schedule. And I mean, was there even a schedule?
We were open every day and there was somebody there.
Yeah, but I don't think we were open at 10 o'clock. I think we were only open
Probably
in the
not.
afternoon.
Probably like noon to 6 or something.
Yeah, because we were going to school.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, you were. Yeah, I was still in high school.
yeah, so was I in '69.
Yeah,
You were still in high school, but that didn't mean you were
I was
going
a sophomore in
to school.
high school. So I'd ride my bike down there after school, like
So
10 miles.
Anyone else? Like Mike, did you ever go into that? Like, did you encounter any of these early stores
Well,
that
I
these
ran
guys?
into Bob's Sidebottom store when I was in college, 5 miles away at Santa Clara University. I don't remember going into your store. I must have, but I don't remember it. But the first big impression was going to Bob's Sidebottom store. And he was the one that actually introduced me to publishing, was by taking me and introduced me to the newsstand distributor up in San Francisco that he bought from, and he took me to Last Gasp and Rip Off Press and Print Mint, and so I got to meet everybody in that field, in which put the idea of publishing in my head.
And was that obviously had a tremendous influence on you? It's like if you could go back in time, would you? It seems like publishing is such a tough business. It was like if only that guy all those years ago would have said, "Hey, go to dental school or something." Would it have been? Yeah.
Well, Dick and I were talking about who made it in that time were the people that were not trying to make money, but people who were having fun.
Yeah.
And those of us who were having fun had a good life. people who were trying to make money at this had a miserable life. And they left.
How small a world was it in the whole kind of I look at all of these early stores and all of these early retailers in the Bay Area, but these cities are not right next to each other, of course. Like, were there just like a whole bunch of different worlds existing simultaneously and you didn't really know each other, or were there, like, did you see each other at cons and know each other?
Oh, well, we knew everybody. I mean, but cons not necessarily. Like Gary Arlington was up in San Francisco, but I don't think Gary ever
We
went
weren't
to a
part of
show.
it, no.
Yeah.
You know, we would know Gary. We'd go up there and visit him and maybe trade with him or something. But, you know, that was a long ways back then. You know, back when you might not even have a car.
In your store, so Seven Sons, which is the store you had before Comic World.
Right.
So Comic World for Bud was the second store. He was already a seasoned entrepreneur at that point. So Gary Arlington's store, which was San Francisco
Comic Book
Company.
Mission in 2030.
Yeah. So you guys started very close to one another.
Just like a month before Gary's store did.
And remind me, and I think I get into the timeline, but were you guys was it just these two simultaneous events that just happened separately? You didn't.
That would be true, yeah, because before that, we didn't know Gary.
Gary's
Gary
about
didn't
underground
know us.
comics, and all the underground artists came into his store, and that's kind of where his sprouted about. And he lived like right around the corner or something. He had a pretty small pond he worked in there.
Yeah, whereas Seven Sons was basically, there was only 6 partners, but there were 6 guys. The rent was $75 a month, is what I remember. And I think we all
was
put
bigger.
in $35 a piece or something for the first couple months' rent. That was it. I mean, no manager, no loans, no. I mean, my parents were probably going, "What are you thinking about?" And I used to take the bus down there because I didn't have a car, I didn't have a license. You know, I take the bus down after work and work from 3:30 until 6 o'clock or something.
So, Jim, meanwhile, you're doing a whole bunch of different things in comics. Can you talk about how you got started in the business and the different things you were doing early on?
In terms of business, I guess the first. Let's see. I drew a strip in the local underground newspaper.
And where was this?
East Lansing, Michigan State University. The paper was called The Paper. And I drew this strip called Land Grant Man, which appeared theoretically weekly for about 2 years.
What were Land Grant Man's powers?
Unspecified. But he would stamp his cane on the ground and like Thor, a lightning bolt would appear and turn him in. He was the president of the university, and he looked surprisingly like the current president of Michigan State University at that time. And he, fought evildoers like students and underground newspaper publishers and other miscreants. I was a comic fan. I had never been to a convention or connected with other comic fans to speak of, and I wasn't into the fanzine scene. So I drew stuff, but nobody ever saw it. In 1970, I met a guy called Ray Walsh, who still owns the Curious Bookshop in East Lansing. He doesn't deal in comics anymore, but for a long time there was an adjacent comic shop that he owned. I helped him move into his first store in 1970. Earlier that year, he and I went down to the Detroit Triple Fan Fair, which was my first convention. Labor Day weekend, I think it was. It used to be the conventions would schedule themselves deliberately for holiday weekends. Now they avoid them, but in those days it was thought to be a good idea. And that was, where I first met large numbers of other people who were into comics. I remember that Fantastic Four #1 was selling for about $30 then. So I started drawing stuff and selling it at conventions. A friend of mine named Frank Tomasic had the brilliant idea, or maybe his partner John Stamps did, of buying new comics from the local magazine distributor and selling them at conventions. This gets you about a 3-week jump on the newsstand, or in those days it did. So I would go along and help Frank at conventions in Michigan and Ohio, Columbus, Cleveland area, Detroit, etc. Did that for about 2 years. 72, 73, I would say. And I was selling my own artwork at these conventions as well. And at one convention, a guy named Tim Donahoe approached me at Frank's booth, and actually it was at my booth at that point, and said, "I'm looking for Jim Friel." And I said, "Yeah, here I am." Donahoe had recently signed an agreement with Marvel Comics to become a direct distributor. This would have made him the second direct distributor. The other one was Phil Seuling. His idea was to basically be a regional distributor so that he would not have to have stuff drop shipped. In fact, he wouldn't have been able to because Seuling had the exclusive right to have things drop shipped, which means shipped directly from the printer to the store. Donahoe was going to run a more traditional magazine distribution operation with a warehouse, and people would be able to specify their orders rather than order in multiples of 25. It all sounded like a very good idea. Unfortunately, Donahoe was not the most savory of businessmen. There's a story about that in the book. So that lasted until early 1975, at which point the Donahoe brothers went out of business. He owed me money. And he said, "Well, I can't pay you, but I can set you up with my few remaining accounts and get you an account with Big Rapids Distribution in Detroit, which is taking over my feed from the publishers, basically." So we did that for a while. I did that for a while. First in my basement, and then in a vacant house down the street, and finally in a warehouse. And that all lasted until 1981. At which point it sort of was coming down to the end because there were more professional operations competing with more money. Sue and I moved to the West Coast. And I was going to do. I had always made money at conventions, and I had always lost money as a distributor. So I thought I'll just do conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't do enough research about the West Coast convention scene. There were already lots of people selling new comics at conventions out here. And the conventions were a lot fewer and farther between than in the Great Lakes area, where you could do one every weekend easily. So that wasn't working out. And then I had two simultaneous job offers, basically, from Bud and from Capital City, Milt Greep, to manage new distribution warehouses that they were opening in the Bay Area. And I went with Bud. And we, had a relationship for several years. Bud's a great employer. At which time I left and went to work for Eclipse Comics. This would have been in '86. Eclipse Comics as sales manager for a year. Eventually they decided they needed a sales manager who would work for commission only. I wasn't going to do that. So I went back into distribution for a while until '94, when everything centralized under Diamond, basically, and local distribution warehouses became a thing of the past.
Let me just say that for when you're working on a project like I was working on, a guy like Jim is, the value of having somebody who had that Midwestern experience and knew these guys who were in the Midwestern scene, and then knows the guys on the West Coast because he moved to the West Coast and worked for all these different people. Like, Jim was able to help me verify facts and just double check stories, and also told me a bunch of stories I hadn't heard from anyone else. And it was just this great, because everyone else a lot of other people were very siloed. It's like they will tell you everything you wanted to know about the New York scene, and Jim was just a godsend. So I thank you for that. And as you can tell just from what he said right there, my goodness, what a career, and doing all of this different stuff. I wanted to. We get later on, and I'm trying to remember who opened first, Joe or Brian. Remind me.
Him by a year.
So 80.
By about 6 months. I think you were April '89.
I was April,
and we were
Fool's Day.
October '88.
Yeah.
You open on April Fool's Day, right?
Open April
That's
Fool's
right.
Day, yeah.
Perfect for the comics market.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
Because we're all fools.
So Joe, what's your kind of? You've got again, like every single one of these guys has kind of stories where you could go all day and all night. But so you, before you became a retailer, you had this whole, you'd been in comics and done a bunch of different things. So walk me through kind of what that was like, your pre-retailer days.
Well, I got bored in my radio job. I was a sales and marketing guy in radio from '78 to '88. When the owner of the station retired and left it to his nephew, things kind of went haywire, and I knew my time there was coming short. So I was looking around for other things to do, and that happened to be at the same time that Marvel was celebrating their 25th anniversary. So I thought I would do this neat little promotion for the radio station and for comics, because I was always into comics, to have Marvel named Stockton, California, the home of KJOY AM radio, the official birthplace of the Fantastic Four. Because if you look at the first page in Fantastic Four, it says something like "in the center of the city," and then later on it was amended to Central City, California. I went, there is no Central City, California. This is so unrealistic. I can't believe it. So I petitioned Marvel and had several hundred comic fans sign at Al's Comic Shop in Stockton this petition asking Marvel to rename Stockton the home of the Fantastic Four. And that got me in touch with Stan Lee, who called me and said he thought it was a great idea. So after when it was accepted and we had this big event on the steps of City Hall, Spider-Man was crawling around Stockton City Hall, and there was a 50-foot banner that said "Stockton welcomes Marvel Comics and Stan Lee to Stockton." It was a beautiful thing, and what was beautiful for Stan at that time was that every camera from every TV station in Northern and Central California was there to interview him. It was a good day for him. But afterwards we went to lunch. We did a signing at the comic book store, and then we went to lunch, and he said, "You know, kid, you did a really good job on this promotion." And I said, "Well, great, Stan. If you ever need a PR guy, give me a call." Several months go by, and I get a phone call. "Joe, Stan Lee's on line 1. It's like, what? And Stan said, "Remember when you said that if I ever needed a PR guy to get, well, I'm giving you a call." And his wife was having her first novel published, which was this steamy romance novel called The Pleasure Palace about love on a cruise ship. And so I got to talk with Stan and Joni every day for about 3 months, setting up interviews and reviews for them about this book. And that brought me to the attention of the retailers in the Bay Area, including Mike. Mike had Star Reach, and they were doing trade shows at that time, and they were going to attach a Star Reach trade show, or attach a convention to the Star Reach trade show, and that was a convention that became WonderCon. So I came aboard WonderCon as the advertising and promotion director. But I also interviewed with Bud. I interviewed with Marvel, with DC. I did a thing where I tried to syndicate a radio program, a radio syndicated 5-minute show about comics. I interviewed Jim for that. I still have the tapes from that. I interviewed him at the '85 San Diego Con. But what I was trying
Where
to
we first met.
yeah, it was. And come to find out later, we're like distant cousins. So anyway, so I was trying to do a lot of different things. I wrote some columns on retail for Comic Buyer's Guide newspaper, and that was me going to school. I wanted to talk to retailers who were in the business at that time and find out, just go to school and see if there was a career in there. And so October 88, we opened here. During the whole course of the 1985 to when we opened, I'd take my family, Libby and our 3 daughters, and we would visit comic shops everywhere we went, and other stores, and then we'd get back into the station wagon, and I'd ask them, "What did you think about that store? Tell me what you liked, what you didn't like." Because I didn't want to build a store that was just the fanboy store. I wanted to build a store that was for everybody, and the way to do that was to bring them into it and make them a part of it. And I think I owe a great deal of the success of what we've done here to those early drives around in the station wagon and our shopping at other comic shops.
And then so soon after that, you open your business. And so this is one thing, when Joe talks about the prep he did to open his store, that sounds like more thorough than like 90+% of it's just like it's like, oh, you want to start a comic shop, just just do the Joe Field. And it's like, it's like, so I imagine your kind of startup process was probably, I don't know if it was more typical, but how did you
I think it might have been a little more typical in that I was working for another comic shop at the time, and he was terrible at his job. He was not good at his job, and I always this is the story I always tell. If when he wrote us paychecks, we knew for a fact that if we took them to the bank that they would bounce, for a fact. So the only way to cash our paycheck was to cash it through the till. And I'm 16 years old working for this guy, and I'm like, I can do better than this. It was almost trying to prove it, for me. I put together a terrible business plan that didn't make any sense if you looked at it, for more than 10 seconds. $10,000 and my comic book collection was what you did it for $21.25.
Yeah.
So 15 years later, it was $10,000 and a comic book collection.
Cost me $16 and $88.
Okay, there you go. All right.
So about that, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if there's a longer story there though.
So one of the things you told me that I thought was what was funny, in addition to being kind of telling about the time, was you said you couldn't have fallen backwards into a better time to open a store.
Oh, sure.
So you had this.
Sure. I opened up right like 2 months before Batman the movie came out
in 1989.
In 1989, the Tim Burton Batman movie, and that like totally changed culture at the time.
Yes, it did.
Like literally anything with the Batman symbol on it sold. Didn't matter what. It could be used toilet paper, and people were like, "I'll give you $20 for that. It's got the Bat logo on it." And we were lucky enough. We were in San Francisco, and Sam Hamm, who wrote the movie, was in San Francisco. So we were able to have him in for a signing, really early on. We had a guy who I met at the premiere of Batman, who had made a homemade Batman costume. We brought him in, for our first thing. Batman Mania allowed a lot of stores to jump into comics, and a lot of people did jump into comics. A lot of people who had no interest in comics at all, and instead thought that they could make a lot of money. One of you just said a couple minutes ago that like anybody who came into this trying to make money ended up losing everything, right? Which is pretty much true. The expression has always been, how do you make a small fortune in comics? You start with a really big fortune. Whereas those of us who were the little low creatures on the ground who did it for $21.25, ended up being able to build something out of it because the reason that we went into comics, the reason that we did this was not because we wanted to make money, though of course we wanted to make money, of course we wanted to make a living, but our motivation to do it was because we really, really loved the thing that we were selling. We were just head over heels passionate about it, and that's kind of really important, I think, and I think that leads to a lot of success. I've seen a lot of people try to go into comics over the years, doing it for what I think are really insincere reasons. And I probably shouldn't judge, what other people's reasons are, but I find that people who went into it going, I'm going to make a bunch of money because I can figure out a way to exploit this, and I can make myself on the back of this, as opposed to I can make myself hand in hand with this. Those people tend to disappear over the years, where the people who really love it and are passionate about it are still here, kind of like cockroaches.
Two things to add to that.
Yeah.
Since I had this 6-month head start going before the Batman movie, a full 1 in every $5 we took in 1989 was bat guano.
Yeah.
I kid you not.
And independently, we would refer to it as the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I was buying T-shirts by the gross.
Yeah.
And that for a business that had only been open for 6 months, to be buying 144 at a time was ridiculous. But that's how that worked back then. Crazy time.
Yeah.
And so, as far as people operating stores, so Dick, you would have been operating a store in '89 as well,
Yeah,
right?
I opened my big guy's store in May of '88. Friday the 13th.
Yep.
An equally good day for comics.
And so that was, I really enjoyed that store. But I ended up selling my whole comic collection to get that store open. And that cost, I had $16,000 in the bank one day, and the day I opened the store, I had $300 left in the bank. And it took a while to get the money back in there and stuff. But I had about $4,000 like the day before I was going to open. And I thought, my shelves are too empty. I got to go down. And I just went down and spent the last $4,000 on a lot of trade paperbacks and really good stuff, because I thought it's one of the things we learned a long time ago. You don't want to create a poisoned well.
Yeah.
The first time people come in somewhere, they'll look, and if it's no good, they don't come back. So, that's
Well, and that was back at the time too, where you could walk into the distributor and buy things.
And that's exactly
from a
what-
distributor.
yeah.
You could do that, and I, the kids who are opening today don't have that. It made a huge difference at the time. I remember going into Bud's warehouse and going, "Wow, that's a great cover. Okay, I'll take this many copies of that because it looks good." You can't do that anymore.
That's a lot of why there may not be a lot of stores ever again. I mean,
maybe.
because really those guys were
Maybe.
salesmen for us,
Yep.
when we would come in. We knew books really well because
Yep.
we'd worked in the stores. But for a new guy to come along and try to open a store, those guys were,
Oh, the other part of it too
Instrumental.
is that we lost the ability to shop, and once we went to the other side of the counter, we stopped shopping. When the distributor stopped stocking stuff in their warehouses, we stopped shopping, and that took us out of the loop, and some of that energy, that passion that went into it when we saw a great cover or whatever, we didn't have that anymore.
instead it's previews now. And it's
It's-
like, oh
yeah.
my God, this
Yeah.
thing's like
Right.
this thick.
Yeah, the joy of
it's
discovery
just-
in this
just try to do a good
field,
job.
this medium is a really key component to making it all work.
Well, it was a really different world then too. We would all go out to the warehouse, the distributor warehouse, and every other retailer in the Bay Area would all be there, and we'd all share stories, and
Yeah.
we'd all commiserate, and
Yeah.
we'd all say what's doing well for us and what's doing badly for us, and it made us better retailers at the end of the day, I think. And if there's one thing that happened out of the exclusive distribution era that I miss more than anything else, is that sense of camaraderie, not just with my fellow retailers, but also with my distribution partners. Because my distribution partners cared as much about what we were selling as we did, which is, there are certainly people at Diamond who love comics as much as we do, but you don't interact with them in that sense anymore.
You don't see them
They're-
personally.
How many warehouses do you think there were in the late '80s when there was like the
I think
heyday
they
of?
topped out at 28.
And that's it
the
for
number I
everybody,
remember.
For who?
or is that just
No,
Diamond?
that's just Diamond.
That was done.
Yeah, that sounds like
Yeah,
just
Capital
Diamond.
City-
So there
Let me
were at
see,
least
when-
8 distributors, and Capital City and Diamond had a lot of warehouses.
There were close to 100.
I think I was
in the
gonna- I
US
would
and
have
Canada.
guessed like 50 to 70
Well,
at least.
Yeah,
And just to kind of just
depending on what you count as
Yeah.
a warehouse.
For-
Sub-distributed
yeah.
warehouse.
for background for people who just aren't familiar with kind of the behind the scenes stuff that we're talking about here. There's this evolution from there being a whole bunch of different distributors competing to sell to comic shops to today where we have one distributor. And Bud, you were in the thick of this. Can you kind of, just for people who aren't familiar with all that, what's a short history of get us from like 1980 to there were a bunch of distributors, and then there were just one distributor,
actually,
and that changed
you should
things a
probably
lot.
back up and say there was no comic distribution business back in 1970, 71, 72. Prior to that, all comics went through local magazine distributors. You got an allotment of 5 or 10 of each issue, and that's all you get.
And you
sell
didn't
out.
get to set your line.
Rexall drugstores.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
you
they
could
were
go to
just-
them and you could say, I can sell 50, and no.
It didn't
sorry.
matter. That's
Right.
the way comics were distributed, and that's why the comic market was going down the hill. And then, as your book points out, Phil Seuling came along and went to the Marvel Comics and went to DC Comics and said, "Let's start. I want to start buying comics from you, and I will give you. There'll be no returns because normally all magazines and comics are returnable in the old system." I'll buy them non-returnable and I'll sell them to comic shops. And now, all you comic shops, you can buy 20 of Spider-Man, and you can buy 2 of this, and 6 of that, and 100 of that, depending on what you think is going to
Well,
be.
Seuling wouldn't let you buy 2 of anything.
Well, whatever.
Later on
Whatever
he
his
did.
minimum
Multiples
was.
of 25.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But
La-
anyway,
later
he
on
came,
it was-
he came along
yeah.
and started the direct market, and that's what you go into really good detail in the book about establishing the direct market. By the time we get to about 1987, 88, you've got 13 or 14 distributors. Things opened up because Seuling had an exclusive for a while, just like Diamond does now, but then things sort of blew open, and that's a whole other long story that's in the book. But there was 13, 14 distributors, and I'm one of them, we're all competing for retailers. We're all opening up warehouses. I opened up a warehouse in Phoenix, Arizona, for God's sake. Places like that, just because we said, well, we're just growing. Let's see if we can make this work. And then I think the big number on that one was Marvel came along and said, we're going to sell our own comics. And they went to Heroes World, and they took over one of the secondary or tertiary distributors who really wasn't prepared to all of a sudden distribute every
Heroes
Marvel
World, no.
comic
No, they
in
were not.
existence. And they did a really terrible job of it. But what happened was also all these distributors that had this big infrastructure, 28 warehouses for Diamond and wherever warehouses for people.
I think Capital City had 21 or 22.
Yeah, they suddenly lost 40% of their market. I think roughly Marvel was 40% of the market. Fortunately, I had gotten out. I had sold my distribution business to Diamond in 1988, so I wasn't there for the big bloodbath. But what happened was you went from having 13 or 14 distributors within, 2-3 years, there was one last man standing, and that was
Right.
Diamond.
One of the horror stories from Heroes World is that even after Marvel went into bankruptcy, we continued to get invoices for things that we never bought. That they were trying to get us for as much money as we possibly could. When they were in business, I would go to pick up my my shipment, and there'd be strange things. I didn't order this. It was like a case of Marvel branded golf balls, and but they were trying to push stuff out there, thinking that we wouldn't catch what was what should have been ours, and it was total mismanagement from the start to the bottom.
I'm curious, Mike, your perspective on that era, because having been a publisher yourself, having been involved with both Marvel and DC, but at the same time, that was around a time when you were taking steps back from the business, right? Or was that not quite yet?
Well, my engagement with the distribution field started when I was a publisher, and I went to a convention in Berkeley knowing absolutely nothing. Bud said, "Sure, I'll buy this," and then I get a phone call from Phil Seuling a week later saying who I'd heard of but I didn't know, and then basically I got to learn by the seat of the pants what the distribution market was like. And so I operated in that for 5 years. And then when my business collapsed and Marvel hired me to set up their direct sales department, it was a mess because they really had no understanding of what the market was all about. And they were making different deals with different people as if no one would know.
Yeah.
And so all I did for 2 years was just do cleanup work and try to get it regular and get people who would be in it for the long haul. So I would identified Capital City, I identified Diamond as the people for the future. And I guessed right, because down the road, those 5 years later, those were the 2 left standing, and then the 1 left standing. But it was. I think I'm going to go back to Brian though. I mean, it was the people that really had a passion for the business. Steve Jeffy and Milton Greep and John
Davis.
John Davis really understood comics.
And those guys are executives at those two big distributors.
Right. They really understood comics, and they hired people that understood comics. Some of their competitors were either disorganized and inefficient, or they were just in it for the bucks. And Heroes World was
Or they were just fanboys who didn't really understand business.
yes, right. And there's a big difference. So having to work through that, find the people that had a passion for the product and had a business sense on their head was a tough path to follow, but that was the job I did.
And that, my goodness, I just can't imagine at that time. I mean, were you aware, in hindsight, you look at when you started at Marvel and when you left Marvel, because you were there for what, about
2 years.
About 2 years. The whole world of the comics business was changing right under your feet.
yeah, right.
And it was, the stuff that was changing was the exact stuff you were working on.
Right.
When you were going to work each day, were you thinking, man, this whole world's changing every day? Or were you just a guy going to a job and dealing with tasks?
Well, I cared about comics myself, so I wanted them sold to everybody that would buy them. But I also knew that you really had to know what you were doing in order to do it well. So, as I say, my job was to sort of teach the market to the Marvel executives, and then figure out who in the market was capable of working with the Marvel system, because they were, they had their own requirements that were different from their competitors.
And
It was fun. I looked forward to going to work. I had a good job, and if they were located in San Francisco, I would have kept working for them. I only left for personal reasons.
Your replacement was Carol Kalish.
Yes, right, yeah.
And you were saying, when I interviewed you for the book, you were saying that, I don't recall the exact wording, but something like one of your greatest contributions to the world of comic shops was hiring Carol Kalish.
Right,
yeah.
right. I knew that I couldn't live in New York for a long time. And once I'd met some personal commitments to pay my bills from my publishing company, that I knew that I had to go home. But so therefore I had a task of how do I replicate myself. And fortunately, they had the business was expanding at Marvel so rapidly that they allowed me to hire an assistant. And so I went out and found Carol and told her on her first day, well, guess what, I'm quitting in 2 months. Get ready. And she was the one that stepped up. She was the smartest person I ever met. And I felt the company was in good hands, and I thought she did a great job.
Well, one of the recurring themes in the book is all of these great professionals, a lot of great professionals who died way too young, and she was one. And Carol Kalish was right after Mike was the direct sales manager. I don't know if was that the exact title.
That started that.
And
she wound up being a vice president.
Yeah, but you talked to
5 years.
Yeah, it was rapidly promoted, and you talked to retailers who knew her. This was someone who could, if she thought you were wrong, she'd tell you. She was, someone who several people said, she didn't suffer fools gladly. Those exact words, like 3 or 4 people said, but if there was kind of sainthood for people in the comics business, she would probably be one of the first candidates if it was retailers doing voting.
And more than that, I mean, she quintupled or better the professionalism of comic retailers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
She was the first person to really listen to stores.
cash registers in
Classic
every
story.
store in
I think it wasn't it Carol that did the cash register?
No,
Yes,
exactly,
right.
exactly what I was
That's
gonna
the story I
bring
was
up.
You're
about.
talking
Yeah.
about comic shops have been around for a long time. This is what 1988, 1989.
Well, earlier,
She came up with a cash register program
She was
simply
doing that by 84.
Get rid of the cigar boxes.
by 80.
But literally, cigar boxes
Yeah.
were what people used. Yeah, that was totally
That's
common.
how sophisticated
We
comic
would
book
write
stores
things down on pieces of paper, and we would have a cigar box at the counter.
So Carol came up with a program that Marvel basically would fund your cash register somehow, and make it possible for you to have a working cash register.
So I remember going to Joe Ferrara in the 80s.
To a
and
retailer in Santa Cruz.
And I who I knew from college, and I'd go to him, and he had a partner, and he'd say, my partner won't let me buy a cash register.
That was Jim.
You know, and eventually, you know, I visited him and he said, well, I bought out my partner. And I said, so when are you buying your cash register? And so we got it the next month.
So one person we haven't talked hardly at all about so far is Phil Seuling, who is this key figure in the development of the comics retail business as we now know it. And just about all these guys have got a good Phil Seuling story. But I wanted to ask maybe Dick and Bud, you guys both told me your kind of your own, separately told me the same story about that first time you met Phil driving to New York. Kind of maybe work together here. Walk us through what that was like.
Well, we would take off in the car in like June, and we would come back in August, and we would go around the country and go to conventions.
And this was 70.
This was 1970 for the first trip.
Yeah.
So we go to there was always one in Dallas or Houston, so we went down to one of those, and then we went to New York, and so we're going to Phil's house, and I'm like 16. I've never really met Phil before, and Bud's how old are you?
17.
17. Yeah. And so we show up at his house at like 11:30 at night. He lives with his wife and his 2 kids,
And
she's letting us
13th floor of a apartment
a
building.
2-bedroom apartment, and he lets us stay there for a couple of weeks. You know.
Yeah, he was putting on the New York convention. At
Yeah.
that point, the equivalent of San Diego Comic-Con was the New York convention. That's where all the artists and professionals would congregate. That was the big show, and so that was a mecca for us, starting in 1970. And so he's not only putting on the show, but he's putting it on as an English teacher who also this was just his day job was being an English teacher, and he'd get his students to help him out at the show and stuff. And but talk about just he just embraced people. I mean, we came from the West Coast. Sure, you can sleep on my in my living room floor. You know, you guys can eat my cereal and whatever. And we helped him put on. We sort of helped in our own little way to put him in the show. I mean, he needed security people. We slept
all night.
Slept
We
in the
stayed up all
dealer-
night.
We slept in the dealer's room, and hey, we didn't have to pay for a hotel room in New York City that way. You know.
Well, and when you came to the door, this was like I imagine. So Phil in his
He
underwear,
looks kind of like a Cro-Magnon
yeah,
kind of guy.
this
And
giant
he-
hulking man,
and his whitey tighties,
Yeah.
Just,
And I would just be. I mean, if I was a teenager, especially if I had never been in New York before, I'm parking a car in New York. I'm going up 13 floors. I'm knocking on a door, and I see this giant man in his briefs. I would just be like, "What in the world's going on?" You know, but he
but he
just
introduced
says,
us to bagels.
"Yeah." He's like, "Come on in."
I
Yeah.
gained like 10 pounds in 2 weeks.
But we were comic book people. I mean,
Yeah.
we both had the same love for
Oh.
comic books. And here's Phil going, these guys came from the friggin' West Coast.
And that
They
is
just
the
drove
that is the common
3,000
thing.
miles to come back to my show. I'm gonna show
So
them a good time.
Phil probably started. There was somebody else started that thing in like '65, and Phil started doing them. I think in
Yeah,
'60.
there was-
So there was a different show.
So maybe
earlier in the
No,
60s,
Phil
yeah.
took over the one.
Yeah.
You know, probably the other guy did it for like 2 years, and Phil from '67 on.
68 was
68?
Yeah.
60. Okay, so yeah, so this was 1970, the first time that we went.
And I wonder, so did everyone here, or no, would you have been in the business? Did you guys ever meet Phil, Brian, and Joe?
I never met Phil. I went to New York Comic Con because I was living in Brooklyn at the time in '75 or something like that. So yeah, I remember those shows. They were pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because there was no geek culture there then. That's the thing to remember. You know, like right now, like all of you probably take a certain amount of this for granted. You know, you turn to the television and there's 30 hours a week of brand new superhero television shows. You know, that didn't exist. It was comics were weird and fringe, and it was not a thing back then. You know, in a lot of ways. So this was the one place you could go to these shows.
And there were all the comic artists in New York.
Yep.
That's where everybody lived. They come turn their work in downtown. And then they would show up at the conventions just on a curiosity, like, what are these people doing down here? I mean, the guys who were the old comic artists didn't really even
He
go
got
there
Hal
yet.
Foster there.
Yeah.
I mean, who did Prince Valiant for years. Hal Foster didn't do conventions. He was an old timer, been around. He got Frank Frazetta there, I think, in 70 or 71. Frazetta was selling original art for $30 a page.
Okay.
Johnny Comment pages.
Everyone starts weeping when they hear that. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he took us out to Frazetta's house, and we got to meet Frazetta and
Yep.
go down into his little place and met his kids and their stories about everybody. Anyway.
I feel like I've said it a couple times before, but I feel like if Phil Seuling was a character in a work of fiction, people would say that's a totally unrealistic character. My goodness, come on, it was just like, you can't make this guy up. He was just such a character. And one of the things, and Phil and also Bud, a lot of independent creators, self-publishers and small publishers, talk about how Phil and you, Bud, basically allowed them to get into the business because you would buy huge chunks of their print runs. And Mike, was this something that was your experience?
Yeah, I couldn't have done it without the help of Bud and Phil. I mean, they were the cornerstone. I had a much more mixed relationship with Phil because I came to work for the Evil Empire, and I had worked with, he'd been a very good customer of mine, but I was already at that point selling to a lot of distributors, and so he couldn't make an argument why he should be exclusive for me. And then 5 years later, I'm now working for Marvel, who had screwed him royally, and he and I would have good conversations. He never yelled at me, but I was always very tense because the business was struggling for him because he had lost so much of it due to the actions of the executives at Marvel before I got there. But I always liked Phil and appreciated his role. I understood Marvel's position on why they had done what they had done,
and what they had done was essentially they were doing business with a whole bunch of distributors then. So Phil used to be close to the only show in town.
He was the only show in town.
He was
when
the
he
only
started.
show.
Yeah.
That was it. If you bought your comics as a comic shop in these various quantities and ordered them in advance, you bought them from Phil. He had the exclusive for a period of time.
So we're at about the 50-minute mark. Do we want to take questions, or I guess so we could go all day. But does anyone in the audience have any questions for these guys? Yeah.
I do have one. I work for Bud in Comics and Comics up in Sacramento, and we did airship comics in late 70s, early 80s, and it was only lasted for like a year or two. And we would have to order airship on Friday. We'd get them on Friday, and we paid 10 cents more a book, as I remember. Someone can correct me. And then the ground ship came in on Monday, and I don't know how that worked into the whole distribution and who was doing it, but I remember we just bought enough to make it through the weekend, and ground ship would come in on Monday. How did that affect the distribution? Where did that come from? The airship price, and it was, I believe, cover price was 50 cents, and it was 10 cents, I believe, a book. More, because I had to sit and order. How many we would go through the weekend.
Well, because the stores were so competitive and the distributors were so competitive at that time, if you could get your comics a day,
Yes.
1 day, 2 days, 3 days before your competitor, you'd sell more comics. That's basically what it was. And I think, was it the guys in the Midwest?
Glenview.
Russ
Hart.
Or Glenn, was it Glenwood? Glenwood, yeah.
Glenwood, which was a guy in the Midwest, came up with the idea, I think,
Russ Ernst.
of air shipping, and he made a deal with the airlines and started drop shipping comics by air into stores. And all of a sudden, to be competitive, more and more distributors had to do that. I resisted it as long as I could. I did not want to get involved in it. Didn't want to be giving money to the airlines, but to be competitive, we had to do it, because if we had stores that were getting their comics 3 or 4 days later than other stores,
It just cost
they're gonna-
everybody a
you know,
lot
we
of
know,
money.
We held it together for a while. We got
we
all the
had
retailers in the Bay Area to agree not to order air freight.
Yep.
So there was no necessity to try to get the jump on each other.
As a fan at that time, I can remember jumping on BART to get to Berkeley and to check out the two stores that were across the street from one another, and one would have new comics and the other wouldn't have them. Well, you know where the business went. That's
how it works.
Yeah, that's just how it worked.
Yeah, eventually the airlines, I think, like Capital claimed they had a really good rate with the airlines, and they broke our agreement
They
in
were
the
using
Bay Area.
Burlington. Yeah.
Huh? And started air freighting stuff in, and so then we had to start doing the same thing, and so there was a lot of money going to the airlines for a while just to get the comics in a couple days early.
Well,
And eventually they
it
were
also
shipping everything
required
by
the
air.
distributors in order to compete with Russ Ernst, they had to set up warehouses at the printing plant in Sparta, Illinois, which was 50 miles inland from St. Louis.
Except for Friendly Frank, who basically did his sorting in the back of an 18-wheeler.
Yeah, even better.
Well, and this, I'm trying to remember who was the distributor. I was somebody was talking to me about they had a building in Sparta, and they had like a fireman's pole. Was that you?
Well, that was Pacific Comics.
Oh yeah, yep.
Pacific Comics got Ken Kruger,
Right.
who's another story entirely. He was their LA manager. They moved him to Sparta, and he set up a warehouse in an old fireman's. And all the comics had to go up. Yeah, how many steps? 32 or 40 steps into the top story of this fireman's place. And when Pacific Comics went belly up, we were talking about something sort of related to that. When Pacific Comics went belly up, again, I was friends with the guys that were running it. They owed me money. And Bill called up and said, we're going belly up. You know, we can't survive. We haven't got any money, but you can have my accounts. And all of a sudden, I was the LA distributor. I'd been distributing up in Northern California. And I inherited that warehouse in Sparta.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
One of the things, when I was at Mile High Comics in Denver, one of the many things in nooks and crannies in that giant place is this old Pacific Comics sign, this big wooden sign. And it might be from that warehouse, or it might be, and I don't know how Chuck Rosansky, the owner there, I don't know how he came to possess it. He probably told me at the time. But yeah, it's just this, there are all these companies that were, a lot of them weren't around for very long, but they had, they brought something to the business. Like Pacific was a publisher of some interesting stuff for a while. They published comics and they distributed comics. But you could almost, you could just go on and on about a lot of these companies that came and went. And one of the interesting things was that Bud's business just, you kind of continued. You just continued when all these people all around you are not continuing. Yeah, it's pretty.
It's because he had gotten out though,
Yeah.
before.
Got out of
So any other questions?
anyway,
Yeah.
Normally in industries, companies are rivals with each other, and the objective is to get the other guy's customers, bring them into your store. With comics, like we were talking earlier about in Berkeley, there was your shop, Comics and Comics down the road. There was Best of Both Worlds. There was Comic Relief right over the corner. It always seemed like comic store owners were more of a consortium than rivals from the outside looking in. And I was just curious, like normally in retail you think a win is when I beat out my other people competing for those customers. What's a win in comics? What do you guys consider to be a win?
I'll tell you a
your
quick
bills.
story.
Sorry.
Yeah, pay your bill.
Speaking as a former distributor for a long time, that's it.
In this area, there was a guy who had a chain of 5 or 6 stores when we opened here. And, yes, and about 2 months after we opened, his stores were all closed on Mondays. On a Monday, he brought all of his store managers here to have their managers meeting, and he walked in brusquely and. I had everyone walk around the store. He kicked a couple of fixtures, saying, "Where the heck did you get these?" And
This looks too professional for a comic shop.
It was intimidation, is what it was, especially for somebody who was still a total newbie in the business. Well, at one point he went out to have a smoke against his truck as the other managers were in here looking around, and he asked one of my staff members out there who was cleaning the windows, how does he get you to do that? And Terry said, "I'm proud of where I work, and I want this place to look as good as it can." Good answer.
Yeah.
Shortly after that, he came back in, and he in a very loud voice, he said, "All right, people, we've seen enough. Let's get out of here. They will not last a year." Right. And left.
Well, yeah.
So rivalries, yeah, there are some, but the end of that story is that another couple of years went by. He knew we weren't going away. We became friendly, good guy, everything, but everyone feels that they have their territory in this business. And until they realize that someone else being in the same territory doesn't necessarily put them out of business, that's the break point between rivalry and let's work together.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also say, when I opened in San Francisco, there were 24 different comic shops in San Francisco, and we were all pretty friendly with one another. I mean, there was a little bit of competitiveness, but it was never cutthroat. It was never, because we all recognized that we were in the same business and we were trying to move it forward, and we certainly disagreed about the way to do it. I thought the way to do it was to promote creators rather than Marvel Comics. But everybody worked with one another because we knew that we were fringe losers, essentially.
For a very long time.
I don't mean to be reductive like that, but I mean, I'm honestly, if the goal every week was, can you pay your distributors? I mean, can you pay your bills? If you can do that, then you've won. It wasn't like I've got to get his customers. It was like, I just need to be able to stay in business another week longer. If I can just get one more week, then all is well.
There was a period in the 80s and 90s, I think, and probably late 70s too, when there were still relatively few comic shops. And there was a feeling it was pretty universal among retailers and distributors that it was a growth industry, and there was plenty of room for everybody to make money. And that the more shops there were, the more business there would be, the more customers would be reading comics. When I was managing Bud's Warehouse in the East Bay, we had a lot of big customers in San Jose, and one of them, he was probably our most reliable paying customer there. Someone opened up a shop literally around the corner, and he was a little freaked, and he dropped his orders a little that month, and the new guys also bought from us, and within 2 months, the old customers' orders were back up to the same level they'd been, and the new customer was just about as big. It was new business.
Yeah. Oh, for certain. No, I remember when Rory took over the store on Haight Street, and there was concern because it was just 8 blocks away from us or something. There was some concern that was going to really draw business away, but it didn't, because there were 2 excellent comic shops in the neighborhood. So it actually became a magnet for people coming who wanted excellent
And I
comic
think that
stores.
is the way it worked.
That's
If
the
there
way
were
it
2
worked.
stores in an area, people would go there because they go to one store and they go to another, especially people looking for
That's why
old
fast
stuff.
food restaurants open up next to each other.
Yeah.
Why
Well,
pizza
I
and-
actually remember going to your store, Comics and Comics, and I would always go across the street down the word to Best of Both Worlds.
Yep.
Everybody
Why
would.
wouldn't you do both?
So,
I'd always
yeah.
go to both.
So we're
And then to Tower Records, and then
And then to Blondie's,
Yeah.
and then
Yep.
to
Oh, yeah.
restaurants.
Yep. And you got a different experience from each of those places, and it wasn't competition per se. I mean, it wasn't.
So we're running out of time, guys. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
What are you doing as a collective or individually to fight the influence of like Amazon?
Well, that's a maybe Joe. You want to take that one first?
Well, there's a difference between what Amazon can do and what we can do. Comics is a business that will bring MBAs to their knees. It is a business in which the people who think they have all the answers don't have all the answers.
Or any.
And again, I mean, it goes back to the quote in the book that we're the cockroaches of pop culture. That we can turn on a dime. We can react to things much quicker than even large companies like Amazon can. Well, they have advantages that we don't have. I think there's always going to be room for friendly neighborhood comic shops, and the fact that Amazon's been around now for how many years? They've lost how many billions of dollars in those years, and here we are. We're the ones who persevere, and we really are sort of the standard bearers for this geek culture, and those other players are just the ones who come along in our wake and try to eat us.
And there are things that we absolutely cannot do. We cannot compete on price. We cannot compete on timely shipping. We cannot compete on a whole range of things. But I don't know that it matters all that much because we're a fringe business, right? It's not we're not selling the new Stephen King novel, which everybody needs to have. That's probably a terrible example, actually. I don't know if people still read Stephen King in that way. But whatever the popular thing is that's not what the thing that we are. We're a specialized, narrow, focused business. And I honestly believe that someone who doesn't know anything about comics can certainly go to Amazon and get some sort of recommendation from the algorithm. It's totally, totally different than if you walk into a well-appointed comic shop that's got quality staff. They're going to take you by the hand in a way that Amazon can't. I mean, they literally can't make the determination that if you like this thing, you're actually going to like this kind of comic. It's not an algorithmic thing. It's a sort of a human emotional spark thing, right? I always say that our job is to set fires in people. You know, our job is to be caught on fire by a piece of artwork, a writer's words, the synthesis between those two things, and then to flame to fan that flame out to everyone else in the whole rest of the world. And if we do it right, and we often do, then when we create that spark in you, then you go and you create that spark in 3 other people, and so on and so on and so on, and it becomes a firestorm. Something like let's say a Saga could never, ever, in a million years happen with an Amazon. It's the hand selling of comic shops and comic shop clerks across the country that makes that thing happen. And I don't think that Amazon could anywhere come close to replace that. We can't beat them on price, but we can beat them on passion. And I think that we do every day.
Well said.
Yeah. So.
No, but just as importantly, support your local businesses. Okay, don't just take us for granted, because one of the things that happens is people take us for granted. And so really support your local businesses so that they can continue to do that in the future. Because particularly a comic book store, and bookstores are the same way, but it's a marginal business. Nobody makes a lot of money doing this. You know, I'm barely keeping my head above water, and I don't say that for sympathy's sake. I'm just saying money is not the reason that we do this. We do this because of love. And so supporting those businesses, supporting those people who do that same thing is paramount. It's the greatest thing that you can possibly do.
Yeah, it is. It's more of a challenge now than it ever has been in the 29 years that the store has been open.
Yeah.
And it's only through the the good graces of people who come in here and are willing to trust our judgment into showing them new comics or buying their regular stuff that we're still here and still viable. And we're very grateful for everyone who walks through the
There's
door.
nobody at Amazon like your staff who always steers me in the right direction.
That's
because
right.
They know me and they know what I like.
Yep.
Oh, thank you.
Well, guys, this has been a great conversation.
I got one
Yep.
more thing to say, and Dan, this has been awesome to have you here. This is a sort of a little bit of a watershed moment, I think, for this business, because it's the first book that's really been written about the business of comics. And the reason I wanted to put this event together was to thank guys like this who have blazed the trail, who have, whether they knew it or not, and they probably didn't, but they were just doing what they loved. What they did is they created a business and a culture that is flourishing now, 47, 48 years after they jumped in. So this is for you guys, and I appreciate all that you have brought to this business, and thank you for it.
Here, here. And for all those who couldn't be here.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you to Flying Colors for hosting this. Thanks to everyone on the panel, and have a great evening. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah,
Buy the book.
yeah,
Buy 2 copies.
yeah,
And not from Amazon.
yeah. Have a good evening, everyone.